Bride's rich mother kicks single dad from wedding, unaware he's the groom's hero father. The ballroom went silent the moment security grabbed his arm. 200 guests in tuxedos and diamond earrings turned to watch a man in a plain gray suit get walked toward the exit like a thief caught mid-heist. His hands weren't shaking. His face wasn't red with shame. He just looked at the woman who'd given the order, a woman in an ice blue gown with a diamond the size of a knuckle on her finger, and said one quiet sentence that made the room go colder than the champagne. "You should probably call your daughter's fiancé before you finish that sentence." The mother of the bride, Diane Ashworth, laughed. It was the kind of laugh rich people use when they think they've already won. "Excuse me? I don't know who let you in here, but this is a private event. Family and close friends only." "I know," the man said. "That's exactly why I'm here." Somewhere near the head table, the groom, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a fitted black tux, had gone pale. He stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped. "Mom, wait. Stop. Don't touch him." Diane didn't stop. She turned to security and snapped her fingers like she was ordering a second round of drinks. "Get him out. Now. He's ruining my daughter's wedding." The man in the gray suit didn't fight the two men gripping his arms. He just looked past them, straight at the groom, and said the words that would end up on every phone in that ballroom within the hour. "Tell your mother who taught you how to survive when nobody else would." The room fell into that particular kind of silence that happens right before something breaks. 3 weeks earlier, none of this made any sense yet, because 3 weeks earlier, nobody at that wedding even knew this man's name. His name was Daniel Reyes, and on an ordinary Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the wedding, he was doing what he did most mornings, standing in the kitchen of a small rented house on the edge of town, making scrambled eggs for his 14-year-old daughter, Mia, while she rushed around looking for her other shoe. Daniel was 44 years old. He had quiet eyes, a 2-day beard he never quite got around to shaving off, and the kind of build that came from actual physical work, not a gym membership. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation and drove a pickup truck with 190,000 miles on it. If you passed him at the grocery store, you wouldn't look twice. That was exactly how he liked it. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a logistics warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of job people described as blue-collar when they were being polite, and just some warehouse guy when they weren't. He'd held that job for 6 years. Before that, his life had looked very different, but Daniel didn't talk about before. Not to his co-workers, not to Mia's teachers, not even to Mia most of the time. He'd built himself a quiet, small, steady life on purpose. Quiet was safe. Quiet meant nobody asked questions he didn't want to answer. "Dad, I can't find my left shoe," Mia said, hopping on one foot near the couch. "Check under Buster's blanket," Daniel said without turning around. "He steals shoes when he's bored." Sure enough, 30 seconds later, Mia emerged from the living room holding a slightly damp sneaker and glaring at their elderly beagle, who looked entirely unbothered by the accusation. It was a small life. A rented house with a leaky faucet Daniel kept meaning to fix. A daughter who was smart and funny and growing up faster than he was ready for. A dog who'd seen better days. And a secret Daniel kept folded up somewhere in the back of his mind, the way you keep an old photograph you don't look at anymore but can't quite throw away. That secret was about to become very relevant, because in 3 weeks, Mia's older cousin, a young man named Ethan Cole, who Daniel had practically helped raise after Ethan's own father walked out when Ethan was 9, was getting married. And Ethan's soon-to-be mother-in-law had absolutely no idea who Daniel Reyes really was. Ethan wasn't Daniel's biological son. He was his late wife's nephew, but after Ethan's father disappeared and his mother struggled to keep things together, Daniel had stepped in without being asked. He'd shown up to Little League games. He'd taught Ethan to drive stick shift in an empty parking lot. He'd sat with him in a hospital waiting room the night Ethan broke his arm falling off a roof he had no business being on. Daniel wasn't Ethan's father by blood. But he was the closest thing Ethan had to one, and everyone in the family knew it, everyone except the family Ethan was about to marry into. Ethan had fallen in love with a woman named Vanessa Ashworth 2 years earlier, in his first year of law school. Vanessa was warm, sharp-witted, and completely unlike her mother, a fact that would matter a great deal later. Her mother, Diane Ashworth, was the widow of a real estate developer who'd left behind more money than sense, and Diane had spent the years since his death making absolutely sure everyone knew about both. Diane was not cartoonishly evil. She wasn't a movie villain twirling a mustache. She was something more familiar and more dangerous, a woman who had convinced herself that wealth was the same thing as worth, and who measured every person who entered her orbit by the size of their bank account and the cut of their suit. She wasn't cruel because she enjoyed cruelty. She was cruel the way people are cruel when they've never once had to consider the possibility that they might be wrong about someone. She'd met Daniel exactly twice before the wedding, both times briefly, both times unimpressed. The first time, at an engagement dinner, she'd asked him what he did for a living, and when he said maintenance supervisor, she'd smiled the thin, polite smile of someone filing information away for later judgment and said, "How practical," before turning to talk to someone more interesting. The second time, she'd asked whether he'd be bringing appropriate attire to the wedding, in a tone that made it clear she already assumed the answer was no. Daniel hadn't argued either time. He just nodded, said something mild, and let her think whatever she wanted. That was the thing about Daniel. He'd learned a long time ago that some people only respect you once you make them, and he'd made peace with the fact that he didn't need Diane Ashworth's respect. He just needed to be there for Ethan. The wedding planning itself was its own slow-building storm. Diane had taken over almost entirely, treating the event less like her daughter's marriage and more like a corporate product launch with her name on the invitation. She controlled the guest list, the seating chart, the flowers, even the exact shade of ivory for the napkins. Vanessa, to her credit, pushed back where she could, but picking battles with Diane Ashworth was exhausting, and there were only so many hills Vanessa had energy to die on before the wedding itself. One of those hills, it turned out, would end up being Daniel. 3 weeks before the wedding, Diane hosted a final walkthrough at the venue, a restored countryside estate with marble floors and a fountain out front that cost more to maintain annually than Daniel made in 2 years. She'd invited close family to finalize details and, more accurately, to be seen doing so. Daniel came because Ethan had asked him to. "Just for an hour," Ethan had said. "I want you to see the place before the big day. Means a lot to have you there." Daniel showed up in the nicest clothes he owned: clean slacks, a collared shirt, a jacket that had seen a few too many winters. It wasn't fancy. It was respectable. To anyone paying attention, it was clear he'd made an effort. Diane wasn't paying that kind of attention. "Oh," she said, when she spotted him near the fountain, in a tone that suggested she'd smelled something unpleasant. "You're here." "Ethan invited me," Daniel said simply. Of course he did. Diane's eyes flicked over his outfit the way you'd inspect a used car you already knew you weren't buying. "Well, do try to blend in during the actual ceremony. We have photographers, you understand. Very reputable ones." It wasn't subtle. A few relatives nearby heard it and looked away, embarrassed on Daniel's behalf. Daniel just gave a small nod and said nothing, because arguing with Diane Ashworth in front of her daughter's wedding venue wasn't a fight worth having. Not yet. But it wasn't the last comment. At the same walkthrough, Daniel struck up a conversation with one of the event staff, a young man named Carlos who was setting up chairs along the aisle. Carlos was maybe 22, polite, quick with a joke, clearly working 2 jobs to make ends meet based on the exhaustion under his eyes. Daniel, being Daniel, ended up helping him move a stack of folding chairs without being asked, just because it seemed like the decent thing to do. Diane caught them mid-task and marched over immediately. "That is not your job," she said to Daniel, sharp enough that a few heads turned. Then, to Carlos, "And you, I'm not paying you to stand around chatting. Get back to work." Carlos flushed red and mumbled an apology, hustling away with his shoulders hunched. Daniel watched him go, jaw tightening slightly, the first real flicker of something harder behind his usually calm eyes. "He was helping me carry something," Daniel said evenly. "That's on me, not him." "I don't particularly care whose fault it is," Diane said. "I care about things running smoothly. Perhaps you could try blending in a little more, Daniel. This isn't a construction site." It was a small moment. Nobody filmed it. Nobody made a scene. But it planted something in Daniel, not anger exactly, more like the quiet recalculation of a man deciding just how much more of this he was willing to absorb for Ethan's sake. The second incident happened a week later, at the rehearsal dinner. Diane had arranged the seating chart herself, and somehow being generous, since everyone quietly understood it wasn't an accident, Daniel had been placed at the far end of the room, at a table with the caterer's assistant and two distant cousins nobody else particularly wanted to sit with either. Meanwhile, Diane's business associates, a state senator she was friendly with, and a country club acquaintance who'd donated to her charity gala sat at the tables closest to the happy couple. Ethan noticed immediately. "This isn't right," he said quietly to Vanessa. "Daniel should be up front. He's basically my father." "I know," Vanessa said, jaw tight. "I'll talk to her." She did talk to her mother. Diane's response was smooth and immovable, the kind of answer designed to sound reasonable while conceding nothing. "Sweetheart, I only have so much room near the head table. I have to prioritize people who matter to the family's standing. I'm sure he'll understand, he seems like a very understanding man." It wasn't said as a compliment. Daniel, for his part, sat at his assigned table without complaint, chatted kindly with the caterer's assistant, a soft-spoken woman named Rosa who'd clearly had a long week, and made sure she laughed at least twice before dinner ended. If he was hurt by the seating arrangement, he didn't show it. Ethan, watching from across the room, felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with wedding stress and everything to do with quiet, simmering protectiveness. That night, walking Daniel to his truck after the dinner wrapped up, Ethan finally said what had been building in him for weeks. "I'm sorry about tonight. About the seating. About all of it, honestly." Daniel shrugged, unlocking his truck door. "It's not your fight, kid." "It kind of is," Ethan said. "You raised me half the time my own dad wasn't around to. You taught me how to shave. You taught me how to drive. You sat with me in that hospital when I broke my arm and Mom was too scared to even look at the x-ray. You think I don't notice how she talks to you?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark parking lot. "People like Diane," he finally said, "they've never had to actually need anyone." "Not really. When your whole life is built on having enough money to make problems disappear, you stop understanding people who solve problems with their hands instead of their wallet. It's not really about me. It's about her never having to see me as anything other than what I look like on paper. That doesn't make it okay." "No," Daniel agreed. "It doesn't. But it's not worth blowing up your wedding over. This is your day. Yours and Vanessa's. I've survived worse than a bad seating chart, Ethan. Trust me." There was something in the way he said that last part, "I've survived worse," that made Ethan pause. It wasn't the first time Daniel had said something like it. Little things, scattered across the years, that never quite added up to a full picture. The way Daniel occasionally spoke with a kind of calm authority that felt out of place for a maintenance supervisor. The old, faded tattoo on his forearm that Daniel always kept covered by long sleeves, even in summer. The one time, years ago, when a man had gotten aggressive with Mia's mother at a grocery store, and Daniel had stepped between them so fast and so calmly that the man had backed off without a single raised voice, like Daniel had done it 100 times before and knew exactly how it would end. Ethan had noticed these things over the years the way you notice the outline of something underwater, present, real, but never quite surfacing. He'd never asked directly. Some part of him understood that Daniel would tell him if he wanted him to know. The third incident happened the following week, and this one hit harder, not because it was aimed at Daniel, but because it wasn't. Carlos, the young event staffer from the walkthrough, had apparently made a small mistake, mixing up a flower delivery order, and Diane had responded by loudly threatening to have him fired in front of the entire event team, reducing the kid to visible, humiliated silence in the middle of the venue's parking lot. Daniel happened to be dropping off a folding table Ethan had borrowed and witnessed the whole thing. He watched Diane tear into a 22-year-old working two jobs over a flower mix-up that wasn't even his fault. The florist had sent the wrong order, while Carlos stood there absorbing it, too afraid of losing income he clearly needed to defend himself. Something in Daniel's expression changed. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more focused. He walked over, calm as ever, and said, "The mix-up's on the florist. I heard them confirm the order on the phone myself." He didn't do anything wrong. Diane rounded on him. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Daniel said quietly. "Because you're about to punish a kid for a mistake he didn't make, and I'm not going to stand here and watch that happen." For a moment, something flickered across Diane's face, not quite doubt, but something close to surprise, like she wasn't used to being contradicted by anyone, let alone a man she'd already mentally filed away as beneath her notice. She recovered fast, waving a dismissive hand. "Fine. I'll speak to the florist. But watch your tone with me, Daniel." She walked off. Carlos, shaken, turned to Daniel with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you. Seriously. I need this job. She's sick, and I'm covering rent and her medication, and he stopped, embarrassed at how much he'd revealed. Daniel put a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. "You don't owe me an explanation, son. You did nothing wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel small for someone else's mistake." That night, Ethan heard about the parking lot incident from Carlos himself, who mentioned it almost reverently, like he'd witnessed something rare. "Your uncle's kind of a legend," Carlos said. He didn't even raise his voice and she backed right down. Ethan smiled, but inside, that underwater outline was getting closer to the surface. The final incident before the wedding itself came just 2 days before the ceremony, and it was the one that finally cracked something open in Vanessa. Diane had decided, at the last possible moment, that the family portion of the wedding program, a small segment where immediate family members would be individually acknowledged during the reception, would not include Daniel. Her reasoning, delivered to Vanessa over the phone with the breezy confidence of someone who didn't expect to be questioned: "He's not really family, sweetheart. Not blood family. I don't want to confuse the guests." Vanessa, who had spent 2 years watching Ethan's face light up every time he talked about the man who taught him to ride a bike after his own father left, finally lost her patience. "Mom," he raised Ethan. "He's more of a father to him than his actual father ever was. You don't get to decide who counts as family." "I'm simply trying to keep things clean and appropriate," Diane said. "This is a big day, Vanessa. I don't want it complicated by sentiment." "It's not complicated," Vanessa said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "You just don't respect him because he doesn't have money. That's what this is actually about, and we both know it." Diane didn't answer that directly. She never did, when the truth got too close. She simply said, "We'll discuss the program later," and hung up. Vanessa cried that night not from sadness, but from the exhausting, grinding frustration of loving someone whose mother would rather protect her own image than treat people with basic decency. Ethan held her and said nothing for a long time, because there wasn't anything to say that would fix Diane Ashworth. There was only the wedding day itself, coming fast, and whatever it would bring. Neither of them knew yet just how much it would bring. The wedding day arrived bright and clear, the countryside estate looking like something out of a magazine spread: white flowers, gold accents, 200 guests in their finest. Daniel arrived early, in a plain gray suit that was the nicest thing he owned, sat quietly near the back with Mia beside him, and watched Ethan get married to a woman who clearly adored him. Everything was fine until the reception's toast portion began. Diane had arranged, without telling Vanessa or Ethan, a small surprise: a state senator she was friendly with, a man named Robert Holloway, a guest she'd been eager to impress all evening, would be giving an informal toast, as a friend of the family. It was, in truth, mostly a chance for Diane to show off her connections in front of 200 witnesses. Senator Holloway stood, champagne in hand, and began a warm, rehearsed little speech about family and love. And then, scanning the crowd for a moment of charm, his eyes landed on Daniel, sitting quietly near the back, and something shifted in his expression. He squinted. He looked again. And then, mid-toast, he stopped entirely. "Wait," Holloway said, lowering his glass. "Is that—" He set the glass down on the table entirely and stared. "Daniel Reyes?" The room's attention, already on the senator, sharpened further. Diane's smile flickered, confused. Daniel, from the back of the room, sighed quietly, the sigh of a man who'd hoped, futilely, that this particular chapter of his life would stay buried just one more day. "Small world, Robert," he said. "Small world?" Holloway laughed, disbelieving, and turned to the crowd, half drunk on champagne and genuine astonishment. "Does anyone here know who this man actually is? Because I do. I served 2 tours alongside him. This man pulled 3 men out of a burning vehicle under fire in conditions I wouldn't wish on anyone. He turned down a medal ceremony because he said the men who didn't make it deserved the attention more than he did. This man," Holloway pointed, voice rising with the particular intensity of someone finally getting to say something he'd wanted to say for years, "is the most decorated combat medic I have ever personally served with, and you've got him sitting in the back like he's nobody." The silence that followed was total. Diane's face went through several rapid transformations: confusion, disbelief, and finally, the beginning of something like horror as 200 wedding guests turned to stare at the man she'd spent 3 weeks quietly humiliating. It wasn't that Daniel was famous, exactly, or wealthy. His post-service life had been deliberately, carefully ordinary, built that way on purpose after years that had cost him more than most people could imagine. But in certain circles, military circles, circles that Robert Holloway and, as it turned out, several other guests at that wedding belonged to, Daniel Reyes was not an unknown maintenance worker at all. He was something closer to a legend, a Silver Star recipient who'd saved more lives than anyone could accurately count, who'd walked away from every ceremony and every spotlight because, in his own words, "the ones who didn't come home don't get a stage, so I don't need one either." He'd built his post-military life around anonymity on purpose. He didn't want to be defined by what he'd survived. He wanted to be Mia's dad. He wanted to be the guy who fixed the leaky faucet and made scrambled eggs and showed up to Little League games. Fame, recognition, medals, none of it interested him. He'd left it behind the same way he'd left behind the uniform. But it was still there, underneath the flannel shirts and the quiet Tuesdays. Diane, scrambling to recover some sense of control, forced a laugh that came out brittle. "Well, I had no idea. Isn't that interesting?" She turned toward Daniel with the beginning of a very different tone, something almost sycophantic. "Daniel, you should have said something." You would have what?" Daniel said, standing slowly, his voice calm but carrying the whole room's silence with it. "Given me a better seat at dinner? Let Carlos keep his job without threatening him first? Put me in the family program you decided I wasn't good enough for?" Diane's face went red, then pale. "This isn't about medals," Daniel continued, and his tone wasn't angry, it was worse than angry, because it was calm and completely certain. "I didn't come here needing anyone's respect. I came here for Ethan. The way you treated me these past few weeks, the comments, the seating chart, the way you talked to that young man setting up chairs like his time didn't matter, that would have been wrong whether I had a medal in a drawer somewhere or not. That's the part you're missing, Diane. It was never about who I am. It was about who you decided I wasn't, based on nothing but a suit and a job title." It was at this point, according to several guests who later described the moment, that Diane, flustered, embarrassed, cornered in front of the very social circle she'd built her entire identity around, made the decision that would define the rest of the evening. "I think," she said, voice tight, "that this has gone on long enough. I'd like you to leave." Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa, at the head table, stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Mom, what are you doing?" "He's disrupting the reception," Diane said, already waving toward the 2 security guards stationed near the entrance, hired originally for crowd control and valet coordination, now suddenly repurposed for something else entirely. "Escort him out." And that's how, minutes later, the room found itself exactly where the story began, with Daniel Reyes being walked toward the exit by 2 confused security guards, while Diane Ashworth stood in her ice blue gown insisting he was ruining her daughter's wedding, and the groom stood frozen at the head table, watching the man who'd raised him get treated like a stranger. "Tell your mother who taught you how to survive when nobody else would," Daniel said, and let the security guards lead him toward the door, not because he couldn't stop them, but because he decided, in that moment, that he wasn't going to fight his way through a room to defend his own dignity. He'd let the truth do that instead. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Let go of him," he said, voice cutting across the ballroom with an authority nobody had heard from him before. He crossed the room fast, physically stepping between Daniel and the security guards. "Get your hands off him right now." The guards, uncertain, looked toward Diane, then back at Ethan, then finally released Daniel's arms. Ethan turned to face the entire room, 200 guests, his new wife, his mother-in-law, all of it, and didn't hold back. "This man," he said, voice thick, "taught me how to ride a bike after my own father left and never looked back. He sat with me in a hospital when I broke my arm because my mom was too scared to even look at the x-ray. He worked double shifts for years to help my mother keep our lights on, and he never once asked for anything in return. He didn't have to do any of that. He chose to. Every single day, he chose to show up for me when he didn't owe me anything." Ethan's voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. "And today, on my wedding day, I watched you treat him like garbage because he doesn't wear an expensive suit. I don't care what medals he has or doesn't have. I cared about him before I knew any of that, and I'll care about him after everyone in this room forgets it. He is my father in every way that matters, and if he's not welcome here, then neither am I." The room was utterly silent. Vanessa walked to Ethan's side and took his hand, tears in her eyes, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Neither am I." Diane stood alone near the head table, the full weight of 200 pairs of eyes on her, her carefully constructed image of control and status crumbling in real time. For the first time in longer than she could probably remember, she had absolutely nothing polished to say. It would have been easy, in that moment, for the story to end with Diane thrown out of her own daughter's wedding, humiliated in front of her entire social circle, punished thoroughly and completely. Some version of this story might have gone that way. But Daniel Reyes hadn't survived what he'd survived, and hadn't spent years quietly rebuilding a life around decency, just to become someone who used power the way it had been used against him. He walked back into the center of the room, past Ethan and Vanessa, and stood in front of Diane directly. "You made mistakes today," he said quietly, so only those nearby could hear. "A lot of them, over the past 3 weeks. But I'm not interested in ruining your daughter's wedding day any more than you already have. That's not who I am." Diane looked at him, stunned, some of the color returning to her face. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why would you?" "Because Vanessa deserves a good memory of today," Daniel said. "And because I think, somewhere under all of this, you actually love your daughter. You just forgot, somewhere along the way, that loving someone means treating the people they love with the same respect you'd want for yourself. That's a fixable mistake. But only if you actually want to fix it." He turned to Carlos, who was standing near the catering table, wide-eyed and clearly terrified he was about to lose his job for witnessing all of this. Daniel gave him a small nod. "You're not in any trouble, son. None of this is on you." Then he looked back at Diane. "I'm not asking you to apologize to me in front of 200 people. I don't need that. But there's a young man over there who's been working himself sick trying to support his mother, and you threatened his job over a mistake that wasn't even his. If you want to actually make something right today, start there." Diane looked at Carlos for a long moment, really looked at him, maybe for the first time all month, and something in her expression softened, cracked open by embarrassment and, underneath it, something closer to shame. "I'm sorry," she said to Carlos, quietly but audibly. "That wasn't fair of me. You still have your job. And a raise, if you'd like it." Carlos, stunned, managed a small nod. "Thank you, ma'am." The reception didn't end in chaos. It ended, strangely, in something closer to grace. Ethan gave a second, unplanned toast later that night, one that had nothing to do with medals or military records, and everything to do with a man who'd shown up, over and over, for a kid who wasn't even his by blood, because that's simply who Daniel had decided to be. Diane spent the rest of the evening quieter than usual, watching her daughter dance with her new husband, watching Daniel laugh with Mia near the dessert table, watching Carlos smiling as he refilled water glasses without a hint of fear in his shoulders anymore. Something in her had been rearranged that night, not by punishment, but by finally being forced to see clearly. A month later, Diane invited Daniel to lunch, just the two of them. It was awkward at first, stiff with the residue of everything that had happened. But by the end of it, she'd asked him, genuinely, about his life. About Mia. About what it had actually been like, all those years ago, doing what Robert Holloway had described in that ballroom. Daniel didn't tell her everything. Some things he still kept folded away, private. But he told her enough. I used to think respect was something people earned by proving themselves, Diane admitted near the end of that lunch, turning her water glass slowly in her hands. I'm starting to think I had it backwards. Maybe it's something you're supposed to give first, and let people prove you right. Daniel didn't say anything grand in response. He just nodded, and said, better late than never. Word of what happened at the wedding spread, as these things do, but Daniel never let it change him. He still worked at the same warehouse. He still drove the same truck with too many miles on it. He still made scrambled eggs on Tuesday mornings while Mia searched for shoes their old beagle had stolen. He was offered opportunities, afterward, people wanting to hire the war hero, wanting him for speeches, for board positions, for things with impressive titles attached. He turned down most of them. I already have the job I want, he told Ethan once, a few months after the wedding, the two of them fixing a fence at Daniel's place on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Being her dad. He nodded toward the house, where Mia's laughter drifted out through an open window. Being someone you could count on, too, all those years. That's the only title that ever really mattered to me. Ethan, hammer in hand, looked at the man who'd raised him without ever needing anyone to notice, and understood, maybe for the first time completely, why it had taken a stranger's toast in a crowded ballroom to reveal what should have been obvious all along. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove how important they are. Daniel Reyes spent his quietly proving, every single ordinary day, what actually matters, and in the end, it was never the medals that made him a hero. It was who he chose to be when no one was watching, and who he chose to remain, even after everyone finally was.